Alright, g'day guys. So look, 5 years-ish coming up for into astrophotography now. Weather's not great here, so I thought I'd do a little bit of a take stock kind of video. What I've learned over 5 years, maybe try and impart some advice if you're going to be new to the hobby. I've chucked all my telescopes down here, well pretty much all of them now. And I thought we could just have a general chat about the hobby. If you're kind of new to the hobby, if you're looking at getting into it, there's a lot of stuff out there now. There's also a lot of marketing crap out there and BS, which is people telling you to buy things, that trying to get you on that conveyor belt of merchandise and just buy the next thing. So I wanted just to put a video together of my thoughts about a few years in the hobby, how I'm still finding it now after 5 years, because we all change. After you do something for a long time, you start to work out what you're interested in, what you find important, what were the big mistakes you made like along the way, and that's pretty easy for me to think about now because I can see it much clearer. Like, as with anything, in hindsight I can see it much clearer. So yeah, I thought, let's have a look at my gear, but I don't want it to be like just a gear focused video. There's enough gear focused videos out there, but obviously gear comes into it. It's a big part of the hobby, astrophotography. Maybe just have a think about it in context now, a few years on. How am I seeing the hobby? Do I still have the passion for it, or have I kind of fallen out a bit with it? So let's maybe start from how I got into it. Okay, so I kind of got into it on the back of, probably like a lot of people, kind of got into it off the back of COVID, because stuck at home. I'd done astronomy a little bit in the past. Like most people, I kind of lived in a Bortle 5-6. If you don't know the Bortle scale, it's kind of a scale of how much light pollution you've got in the sky. Basically, if you've ever been to a really dark camping trip, and you can see a lot more stars than you normally would, that's kind of like a Bortle 1, like really good quality skies, no light pollution. Bortle 9 is when you live in the middle of a city and you can only see a few bright stars in the sky because it's all washed out with all the light pollution. So, I'm in an average light pollution sort of place. I'm about a 5-6, like middle light pollution. So I can see the main stars and stuff, but you can't see that detail or anything in the Milky Way. But anyway, I'd done a bit of astronomy before. And I had a couple of little telescopes just for visual, just for looking through. I'd had a Dobsonian design telescope, and I'd had a little Schmidt-Cassegrain design telescope as well, which was on like a little go-to mount. A go-to mount, if you don't know, it's like one of those mounts where you get like a little hand controller and you go through a little process of aligning your mount. It's all powered, a powered mount. And then after you align the mount, you tell it where you want to go in the sky, like go to the Orion Nebula or whatever. So I'd had a couple of those, but then I kind of started to think about putting my DSLR onto the back of a telescope. And I did a bit more research, and I found that it did look hard, but maybe not as hard as I thought it was going to be. And I will say that for astrophotography, there's no doubt that there is a fairly, even today, 5 years on, I think it's got easier, but there still is a fairly sort of steep learning curve. It certainly helps, I think, if you come from a photography background. So if you probably understand cameras already, like DSLRs and lenses and things like ISO and aperture, that does help quite a bit, because some of the concepts are obviously the same. We're basically looking at big kind of camera lenses, so things like focal ratio and focal length are still really important. So that's how I kind of got into it, and what I started within the hobby was one of these, which is an 80mm refractor. And more often than not, you'll always hear people say if you're going to start in the hobby, you get an 80mm. Not necessarily 80, 70mm, 80mm, even 100mm, that one back there, that SV Boney, the white tube there. They're all good telescopes to begin with because they are not too heavy. You want something that you can just chuck outside on your mount. Most of us don't have an observatory that we can just leave our telescope in, so we have to put it on and off every night. And you're much more likely to do that if the thing does not weigh a ton, okay? So these telescopes like this, 3 kilos, maybe 3 or 4 kilos over there, nice and easy to lift on. These days there's a bunch of refractors around which are very affordable. You'll often hear terms like doublets and triplets. That's like 2 pieces of glass, 3 pieces of glass. Triplets are generally better corrected than doublets. However, these days you get these kind of doublets, like in this little Skywatcher ED80 here, very well corrected still. Maybe, not quite as good as a triplet, but still very, very good. And because processing software now, so astrophotography images, you're always going to have to process them in some way on your computer, yeah? And because the processing software has got so good, sometimes even if you're having issues with those images that you take, because maybe your telescope is not the absolute premium telescope, you can fix a lot in what's called post-processing, so after you've taken the images, yeah? So I think it still holds true that 5 years on, I would still recommend an 80mm refractor. They're really low maintenance as well. You don't have to do a lot. You don't have to do things like collimation, which you would have to do with something like a Newtonian, and to a lesser extent a Schmidt-Cassegrain. But great telescopes to begin with. If you put a good dedicated astrophotography camera on a 70mm, 80mm, 100mm refractor, you can have hours and hours of fun. You can take tons of objects in the night sky, very versatile, that kind of focal length. This is 600mm, that one over there is 700mm. So many objects you can take at that focal length that, as an all-round starter telescope, brilliant, okay? Now, if you're asking me, is there one telescope I can buy that will do everything? In theory, there kind of is. A Schmidt-Cassegrain like this, you can actually do things to it to change the focal length substantially. So this natively is 2350. So this is much, much more zoomed in than this at 600. However, it's got the facility to it's actually got the facility to take one of the mirrors out here and stick a camera on the front, which brings it down to like, I think 600mm ish, like same as this. The problem is that in theory that's true, but in practice you then end up messing around having to change things over, and most people actually tend not to do that, okay? But yes, technically you can. So if you wanted to, say, buy one telescope that was very versatile and could do all sorts of things, then a Schmidt-Cassegrain design, an 8-inch or even a 9¼ inch like this one, is a great all-rounder that you can do tons with. You can use it for visual, you can use it for a little bit of planetary, you can use it for some deep sky astrophotography, you can put a reducer on it and use it for more deep sky astrophotography, and then you can put the fast star imaging system on the front and turn it into a high speed 500-600mm imaging rig as well. So you can do tons with those things. But like I said, for me in practice, I just use that as a long focal length telescope to take images with, okay? And I use these ones when I want to take things at like 600mm. So, like I said, I've been doing this a while now. What would I say in terms of pitfalls of the hobby? Well, the biggest pitfall is you start buying stuff too quickly, okay? You get bedazzled by all the things and all the YouTube channels telling you this is the latest, this is the greatest, this is the new thing, and you just start accumulating stuff. And the reality with astrophotography, the reality is for most of us, you really don't get that many really good nights, clear nights where you can get outside and actually use your gear. So for me down here in Australia, in Victoria, and kind of right down on the south coast, we get a lot of cloudy nights, and it can easily be 2 weeks between me having an opportunity to use one of these telescopes. So sometimes people build mountains of gear, and in reality you're using the thing once every 2 weeks, okay? So I would definitely say the pitfall is don't start buying too much stuff too soon, okay? So yeah, look, my number one tip is when you buy your first telescope, be it this or whatever it is, just use it. Get outside when you can and use the thing, and don't worry too much about what everybody else has got or what the latest and greatest thing is. Now, I know I've got a few telescopes here. That's true. Most of these are actually pretty much all of these are second-hand, apart from that camera lens. There's a lot of gear around in the hobby, and if you're patient, you can actually pick stuff up pretty reasonably priced second-hand. These have mainly all got different uses. This one I use a lot for solar imaging when I image the sun. That one, like I said before, is my long focal length telescope. So if I want to do planetaries, if I want to image the planets, I use this one. I do also do some deep sky astrophotography on things like galaxies or things I need to get close into. This little camera lens down here, so camera lenses are great for astrophotography too. This is a 135mm Samyang camera lens, very widely used camera lens in the hobby, and this is great for taking big nebula. Like, for example, I recently took the Vela supernova with this thing, and it's also just useful for taking really nice wide images. So sometimes those nebula, we can group them together. Like, maybe I want to get Carina, and I want to get the running chicken nebula sort of together, and I could use something like this or do a mosaic with something like this, and you can make these big expansive astrophotography images where you are capturing a lot of that sort of hydrogen around these objects as well. But the point being is there's lots of different designs of telescopes that are particularly well suited to different areas of astrophotography, and also there's designs that are sometimes there are designs that are inherently a bit cheaper. So this little guy back here, this little Newtonian telescope, is a little 6-inch Newtonian, a great little telescope, but you do need to be a little bit more aware that you do need to be a bit more of a tinkerer. Like, there is collimation to do on these kinds of telescopes. They use mirrors, and you've got to make sure those mirrors are all aligned with each other. So there's a thing called collimation, which you often have to do periodically, okay? So they take a little bit more maintenance than a refractor, okay? So there's different styles, as you can see, different styles of telescopes for different things. There's no one real correct telescope. If you're going to get into the hobby and you're going to stay in the hobby, for most people, unless you become a specialist in one thing, for most people you'll probably end up with 2 or 3 telescopes for doing different things with. Also, naturally, galaxies are often, you need a longer focal length telescope for galaxies as well. So the other thing is going to be cameras. You need a dedicated astro camera, okay, for this hobby. Now I did the whole gamut. I went one-shot color camera with a narrowband filter on it. Often you get these narrowband filters which allow you to take long exposures of nebula, even when you're in a fairly light polluted situation like I am. But then I wanted to try mono imaging out, because I know that in theory, mono imaging, you collect more signal because you're not putting your camera sensor does not have that Bayer matrix on it where it's sort of splitting the color up, okay, and it's you're almost not getting the best out of your camera sensor in a way. So I went through mono imaging, and I did that for a couple of years, and then I came full circle, and I actually found, considering how often I'm doing this in terms of how often I get clear skies and how much I'm enjoying it, I actually found it much more simple to just use a one-shot color camera, and that's my personal preference in the hobby. Some people will be die-hard mono imagers. Me personally, I just like using a one-shot color camera like this, and then I put in one of these duo narrowband filters, which filters out some of those narrowband wavelengths for me, like hydrogen and oxygen, and it means I can still take those nice long exposures even from my sort of moderately light polluted backyard. I'm kind of a Bortle 5-6, which is kind of moderate light pollution. So my advice would be, don't get hung up too much on gear. Try and, at least for the first year, just buy maybe a telescope and a good mount, a good mount is essential. Like, if I could say where to spend most of your money, spend it on your mount, yeah? Get a good solid mount. These days they've got the harmonic mounts, and you've got the sort of more traditional belt and gear sort of mounts. I just use the sort of traditional mounts, you might call them. Like, so I have a Skywatcher HEQ5 Pro, which I started with 5 years ago. That thing still performs flawlessly. And I've recently actually got an EQ6R Pro. So me personally, I think those kind of mounts are still fantastic. But then again, I mainly image from my back garden, so I'm not moving my mount around a lot. If you are moving around a lot, and if you need your mount to be particularly portable, then sure, maybe a harmonic mount could be for you. But if that's not an issue, there's nothing wrong with the kind of I don't know whether to call them old school mounts or traditional mounts, but yeah, there's nothing wrong with getting something like an EQ6R Pro or a HEQ5 Pro or one of the other equivalents of a different brand. So yeah, make sure that you do spend money on a mount that's got more than sufficient payload for what you're going to put on it. So, you know, if you're starting off with something like a little 3 kilo refractor, just think about the fact that you might down the line want to put something like an 8-inch Schmidt Cassegrain on it, which will be a bit heavier. So, you know, my very first mount was a HEQ5 Pro, and that's been a fantastic mount because not only could I put something like this on it, but I can also put my Newtonian here, which is about, probably now with everything loaded on it, is probably more like 6 kilos, yeah? So it pays to probably buy, you know, the best mount that you can afford at the time and make sure it can handle a good payload. And with all this stuff, make sure you go to astrophotography forums. There's Cloudy Nights is a really popular American one. There's one I think called Stargazer's Lounge, is it? And look at what people are saying about these things, because yeah, it's always worth getting some first-hand experience. But in terms of mounts, like I said, there's tons of good mounts out there, but definitely don't skimp on your mount because you'll regret it. Yeah, but back to the cameras briefly. For me, one-shot colour is the way to go. Just convenience-wise, I just prefer it. Mono imaging is fantastic, and some of my best images are from my mono images and rigs. But in terms of what makes me happy and what my preference is and what I feel most chilled out doing, it's just a one-shot colour rig. And these days, you know, the sensors in these things are so good, and the cooling on these astrophotography cameras, if you've never done astrophotography before, generally for deep sky imaging, where you're taking very long exposures, 3 minutes, 5 minutes, 10 minutes, your camera will be a cooled camera, and the cooling on these things works so well, and the sensors are so good in terms of noise, that these days even these one-shot colour cameras are amazing how good images that they can actually take. So look, you've got all your different telescopes there, you've got your cameras. Now that one, I don't know if you can still see this in frame, but this Celestron here has got a little mini PC on top of it, so you will need to connect your camera up and your mount to something. It's your mount and camera have to be connected to some sort of control device. So a mini PC is what people often use. Sometimes people just use their laptop, which is great if you're just getting into the hobby. I actually have a massive long cable, and I actually connect my desktop PC in my little garage here right out to my mount outside. Okay, so you can do it that way, but not many people do that. I just do it because I'm lucky that I'm very close to where my mount's going to be, so I actually use a big long cable. But sometimes I use that mini PC. Other people like to use a dedicated control devices that are built specifically for astrophotography. So the ASI Air is a very common one by ZWO, by this brand, this red sort of brand. A lot of people use that, a lot of people love it. You can connect that to your phone, you can connect it to your tablet, and you can control it all via, you know, touch screen. So that's fantastic as well. For me personally, I mainly use software, Windows-based software called Nina. Nina is again one of the probably the most commonly used Windows-based control software. Okay, so there's many options, but you're going to need some way to control your mount, okay? So, you know, there's layers to this hobby, and it's easy to get overwhelmed and stressed. So I would say don't put too much pressure on yourself. You know, you don't have to take every single, you don't have to maximize every night to the nth degree. Just, you know, if you only do a couple of hours one night and you want to pack it in, that's fair enough. If it takes you a couple of months to get your final image of an object, who cares? Then it takes you a couple of months, okay? So don't worry about trying to get everything done as quickly as possible. It's going to take you time to learn this hobby, so give yourself plenty of time to learn the various aspects of the hobby. In the beginning, I would just say the most important part is get to know your telescope, get to know your mount, and get to know your control software, and just experiment, play around a lot with it. You know, one thing, for example, you'll find you definitely need dew bands, yeah, because the glass inside your telescope with the dew point, you'll get condensation, so you'll definitely need something to control dew. You'll in no time find out that you need an automated focuser, because you can't be out there all night changing focus as it gets colder and warmer, you know, with the environment. So you'll end up putting an automated focuser on. You'll very quickly end up buying a guide scope and a guide camera. You can think of those as just connecting to your mount, and they let your mount know if it's not tracking perfectly, and they make little corrections for you, okay? So no mount is going to be 100% perfectly, okay? So your guide scope and guide camera are just there. It's usually a fairly inexpensive camera and a relatively inexpensive little, what it is essentially is a very little basic telescope, and all they do is they just track the sky, they lock onto a star, and they just check that your mount is actually staying where it should be, okay? So very quickly you'll need dew bands, you'll need an automated focuser, and you'll probably need a guide scope, okay? There's not really a way around that in this hobby, but there's many different ways to often do the same thing to solve these problems, okay? So where were we with all this? So that's, as you can see here, lots of configurations, lots of different types of telescopes that suit different things. The next thing I'll say on top of it is you can have the best telescope in the world and you can take some cracking images, okay? You can have a really good sensor, really good camera sensor, a really good telescope. However, if you don't know how to do some basic processing on those images, then let's just say you're probably not going to get the best out of the images that you've taken. When you initially take those images, they're not going to look great, okay? The individual images are not going to look great. You'll have to stack those images, and then you'll have to process that stacked image, that one image that comes out of the end of it. So you'll take many images for many hours, as many as you want, you know, many hours as you want. Usually there's a minimum, like usually it'll be a minimum of probably, you know, who's to say, but a minimum of probably a few hours worth of images, let's just say that, okay? If you were taking 5-minute exposures, you'd probably take a minimum of a few hours worth of images. But it can be many hours. It can be 10 hours worth of images, it can be 15, 20, whatever. But you need a bit of basic knowledge on how to process those images. So most people these days will use a piece of software called PixInsight. It's a dedicated piece of software for processing astrophotography images. There are also free software like Cyril. I know some people use Cyril. I've never used it personally. There's a piece of software called Astropixel Processor, which is for just specifically for stacking your images. Very good at stacking images. I use that. Again, there's a free piece of software called Deep Sky Stacker. Good piece of software for stacking images if you're just new to it and you want to give it a test. But my point is with all of that is that this hobby splits down into sections, okay? Knowing how to use your gear, knowing how to use, you know, your camera, you know, what the night looks like, in other words, you know, how much moon is going to be out tonight and what you're going to do on that particular night, and then processing the images at the end and having a bit of knowledge. Watch a few YouTube videos and learn how to do some basic processing of your images. And yeah, there's a heap of fun, and I still really enjoy this hobby. What I've learned though over the years is not to rush it. So it takes as long as it takes. What I tend to do now is I just tend to have one rig going at a time. Sometimes I'll have two. I used to sometimes even have 3 rigs going. I found that as time went on, that got very stressful. So these days I tend to just have one rig going. Sometimes on a weekend I'll have 2 rigs going. But the point being, enjoy the hobby. Don't just rush to get the image, okay? Enjoy being out there. And if you are finding that you're getting a bit overwhelmed, or that you're losing the passion to get out there and take more images, because often you get to a point where you've taken that same object times before, then nothing wrong with getting out the eyepiece and the diagonal and have a look through your telescope as well. There's nothing wrong with that at all. I try and do that periodically, when I'm getting a bit kind of, finding that I don't have the motivation to get out there. I sometimes just put the eyepiece on and I just get the hand controller and I have a look around the night sky. So look, there's probably a ton of stuff here that I've not even covered, but I just wanted to give you, if you're thinking of getting into the hobby, a bit of a breakdown of, there's a bunch of telescopes you can use. There's the cameras, there's the hardware, there's the control devices, there's the software. But for me, the most important thing is use the gear that you've got. Don't rush into buying too much stuff. You don't always need to buy the greatest and the latest. There's a bunch of second-hand gear out there. Like I said, most of this is second-hand. And just enjoy it. And enjoy, as they say, enjoy the process, okay? So look, hope that helped. And get out under the night sky and enjoy it. Hope that helped. Catch you later, guys.